1945 was, after all, when she was over 34 years old. So there's quite a lot of her life, if we're going to talk about the life and times, before she ever did this. But there were signs that she'd be just what she was as you went along. Let me try and very quickly sketch that time and leave the time with USC to the next two speakers. She was born in Prague in 1909, and she and her sister, Lily, who was 2 years younger, went through high school together. In fact, they sat at the same desk for 8 years. And even at that stage, she showed the sort of outreach that she had forever. Two stories from her childhood. One was that at the high school there was a recess between different periods. Latin and Greek they were studying, and this is in a school that taught in German, in gymnasium there. And in the recess time of 15 minutes, the other children gathered round her to get her translation of the course of the lesson that was still to come. And so people were looking to her even at that age. And she was reaching outwards also because she heard of a rumor that by the Streetcar Commission that if anyone collected 10,000 used bus tickets in the city of Prague, the Streetcar Commission would donate limbs for Austrians and others who were had been injured in the war, and Czechoslovakians, of course. And she managed by dint of about a few months to collect 10,000 used bus tickets from other students, from bank people, and so on, and went along proudly to the commission, only to be told that the whole thing was a hoax. So she went home and cried about that. Not many times did Lotta cry publicly. Her father came from quite a poor family in Bohemia, and he learned to be a producer of malt, quite a complicated business for brewing. And she was able to go through high school and enroll at the University of Prague for her PhD. And she persuaded parents that she would go off to Paris for 2 years in the middle of that time. And there she picked up another language. She spoke Czech from her nanny when she was young, and then a governess who spoke French. The family spoke German at home, and she picked up English and Spanish and Italian and all these along the way. She was a very talented woman, even though, in fact, the USC was not going into French at that time. In her years, she came back from Paris and finished her degree, and she had to find a living, and she became a political journalist, and particularly she was aiming at 3 countries, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, that formed a petite entente and anti-Nazi, really. And she was a lively writer who, no doubt, the Nazis had her on the list. And after the Munich Agreement in 1938, people urged her to get out of the country, and so she did fly out of the country, was in Belgium for a year, and then in May 1940 the Germans broke through, bombed Brussels heavily, and she was in the city at that time. So she saw things then as a victim of bombing, and as a refugee. She went all the way down with René Debut down to Bordeaux and so on, and spent a year in the Ardennes. Not the Ardennes, the Provence. And she was longing to get out of Vichy France, and it took her, in fact, about 2 years to do so. And during that time, she was working in Marseille for an international migration organization, and short of food like other people were. He actually fainted in the streets of Marseille one day and was carried off to the USC clinic there, the USC Boston clinic. The people in Boston had done tremendously good work for a number of years in getting Jewish internationals smuggled out of Germany, out of Czechoslovakia, and over the Pyrenees and into North America. And she tried to go the same route, and she returned back. She didn't get much help from the Americans. And anyway, she eventually did get out. And before she got out, Dr. Zimmer, who'd done a big report on the internment camps, they were almost concentration camps, internment camps in Marseille, on 9,000 refugees that were there, Spanish refugees from the Civil War, German anti-Nazis, and so on. And she carried this report back to the USC Boston when she eventually got out through Lisbon. And USC Boston played a quite large part in her life. For the first year or so that she formed USC in 1954, 60, what year are we in?
45.
45,
yeah.
I'm sorry, so many dates in this. And when the 6 Unitarian churches in Canada came together to form a group like that, she went on a great tour of the West. Winnipeg was very strong in its support, and the group in Ottawa had set out as a principle that they would be aiding as much the war-damaged children of Czechoslovakia and France in particular. Many children in France had actually been bombed, obviously accidentally, by Allied bombers, and those were her first people too. And clothing was terribly important as well as food in those days. And the gathering, she always thought that people should be active as well as talking. One of the very first things that were done were groups of people coming together in those first years to gather clothing for children. And she encouraged art as therapy, really, among these children. And some of the documents that are in the archives among all her notebooks are documents that children sent back from these schools around and homes around Paris that were supported for these damaged children, many of whom had lost legs and so on. I'd like to go on, but I don't think I should at this point, but I'd like to say that in writing this book many years afterwards, I first of all, I wrote an earlier book about the aid recipients of Canada, and that was the time that I first met Dr. Lotta, and in order to find out about Korea, and she gave me introductions to people in Mokpo, in the southern part of Korea. And when I went there, I'd heard that there were many hundreds of thousands of children without education there, out on the streets. And I was told that when Lotta had gone out there with her notebooks, she knew the names of all the street kids in Mokpo, the shoeshine boys they were mostly. And I went into some of the homes there, and the kids were sleeping. It was sandwiched in between each other, about 6 to a bed. Those were tough days, and Lotta was, of course, the first agency in Canada, voluntary agency, to form an organization that was UNRWA. She'd worked in UNRWA for a short time, but she was not impressed by it. And that's when she came back here and formed, with the help of USC Boston, the USC. I'd like perhaps later to say a quick word about my trip when I went. I'll let Joyce talk first about going to the little town of Mesavouno in the middle of Greece, which was very striking, very moving, and a remarkable achievement by Dr. Lotta, who was well remembered there many years afterwards.
Thank you, Clyde. David?
Thank you. It is a real pleasure and honor to be on this panel with two dear friends. Joy out west, who has some remarkable Lotta stories to share with you shortly, and Clyde, Lotta's biographer. Until last year, I worked with USC's fundraising team, and not a day went by when I did not feel some indebtedness for Clyde's painstaking work in putting together Lotta's biography.
Thank you.
I believe this was a service to all Canadians, in fact, and I'd like to acknowledge that right at the outset. And thanks also to you, John, the Unitarian Historical Society, and USC Canada, our host here, for offering this unique chance for people to learn more about this great Canadian woman. My own Lotta story begins in Vancouver, where I grew up in the 60s and 70s. I vividly remember seeing her on TV, and like many youngsters, we took some delight in trying to imitate her distinctive accent. Was that Lotta laughing? This is Lotta Hitschmanova of the Unitarian Service Committee, 56 Park Street, Ottawa 4.
Not bad.
Her face, her voice, her uniform, they were everywhere. In the newspapers, on the radio, and in her famous TV ads. Lotta played a unique role in our social history. Long before there were 24-hour news channels, she educated Canadians on the plight of people in far-off lands, and she mobilized generations of Canadians to take action and help. Many were inspired by her words, including me. When I set off in 1979 on my first overseas trip to Africa, a piece of Lotta flew with me too. And part of her spirit stayed by my side throughout my 35 years in international development. And I know I'm not alone, as the following reminiscence attests. I can remember her voice so distinctly on the CBC radio noon program that my parents listened to in rural Saskatchewan. As a small child, I conjured up my own images of her work and was amazed how it influenced me in the years that my husband and I lived and worked in Africa and Asia. And a woman from North Hatley, Quebec, shared a similar childhood story. When I was a girl in the 40s, I walked to and from school 4 times a day. We always knew when it was time to return to school because Lotta Hitschmanova would come on the CBC every weekday before the 1 o'clock news to say she was from USC and to support her by sending money to 56 Park Street. Nova Scotia writer Joan Baxter speaks for many Canadians when she put it like this. It was Lotta Hitschmanova who shaped my values as a Canadian and the type of Canada I believe in. She helped give us our identity. The sincerity of Lotta's message of hope and compassion was so strong that thousands of Canadians became lifelong supporters. Dozens of volunteer groups sprang up in cities and towns across the country. My own grandmother, Mary Rain, regularly volunteered at a fire hall in Winnipeg. Scratch the surface a bit, and we may all discover similar stories and connections. Here's a passage from Clyde's biography. David B. Smith was a USC volunteer in Ottawa in the 50s, and later on the board chair of USC Canada. He was asked how Lotta had managed to develop such a large and loyal team of supporters across the country. He put it simply, once you were thanked by Lotta Hitschmanova, you came back to do more. This reminds me of a trip to St. Catharines, Ontario. Excuse me. An elderly USC supporter came to see me after my talk. He wanted to present me with a check for $500 in Lotta's memory. But amazingly, this was not the most important piece of paper he wanted to show me that day. From his briefcase, with his hands shaking, he pulled out a handwritten thank you note from Lotta that he had kept all these years. In 2009, I visited Calgary in the middle of winter. I was kindly hosted by a Unitarian couple, John and Helen Backhouse. And if you're listening, hi. At one point, the 3 of us were chatting away in their kitchen, and we somehow landed on an awareness that, hey, 2009 is actually the 100th anniversary of Lotta's birth. But nothing's happened yet. Shouldn't there be some kind of celebration? And thus, in the Backhouse kitchen, the germ of an idea sprouted. And to make a long story short, USC Canada gladly accepted their challenge and proceeded to launch a nationwide campaign. First producing a special Lotta 100 PSA that was broadcast across the country. Next, special CDs and DVDs about Lotta's life were created and distributed to Unitarian congregations and other groups. And over 50 special events commemorating Lotta's centenary were organized from coast to coast. The Lotta 100 celebrations created a unique energy, something I had never witnessed before. People felt the urge to publicly share their Lotta stories, what she had meant to them, how they had first met her, and so on. Here is a story from November 1961. I was with my 2 children in the Toronto airport. After a long trip, we were tired and cold. Dr. Lotta began to speak to the children, and it was she who helped me and the children board the aircraft. She took my son to sit with her and kept him entertained on the flight to Ottawa. Ever after that trip, whenever my son saw her on TV, he would call me, "Mom, there's Dr. Hitschmanova." We have never forgotten her. Lotta's harrowing and tragic experiences as a World War II refugee are well known, as Clyde has just briefly touched on, as was her empathy for those who had suffered due to human conflict. In 2010, an 87-year-old Saskatchewan woman shared her story with me. In the fall of 1954, she and her 2 small children set sail from Hamburg for the arduous week-long voyage to Canada. When the boat docked in Quebec City, everything was chaotic. The nervousness of being a refugee with small kids in a foreign land, unable to speak English or French, soon took hold of her. A kindly figure in an army nurse's uniform came forward. and took her under her wing. It was Lotta. She helped her with luggage and getting through customs, and Lotta arranged daycare for the kids while all the formalities were undertaken, a simple yet thoughtful act that she never forgot. She never saw Lotta again after that day to thank her in person. But she always retained this deep, fond memory of what Lotta had done for her on that difficult first day in Canada. And thus, 56 years later, she felt the need to share her story so that others could learn about the kind of person that Lotta was. I don't know whether Lotta had true charisma as such, but there can be no doubt that her total sincerity and drive to make the world a better place, coupled with her genuine gratitude and appreciation for others who made a contribution, all created a magnetic personality that itself inspired many of Canada's finest citizens to lend a hand. Here is what music legend Bruce Cockburn has related. When I was 10, I first met Lotta Hitschmanova when she came to my classroom. She radiated love and concern. When I was 25, I received royalties from radio play of my first album. It felt like such a godsend that it seemed appropriate to share it with those less lucky. And that was how Bruce Cockburn became a donor and later on a USC spokesperson. Vernon Burroughs heard Lotta speak in the 1970s. I stood in awe of her dedication to help the underprivileged. A renowned oat breeder, Dr. Burroughs promised himself that if I could produce an oat for people in third world countries that they could eat like rice, I would do so. I think it fitting if the first oat available for evaluation would carry the name Lotta. Many years later, in 1991, he carried out his promise and named one of his hulless oat varieties, AC Lotta. It is fair to say that for the bulk of her working life, Lotta was the most recognizable woman in Canada. She lived in a man's world and yet was a very successful woman. I don't know if she was a role model for other women, but there is no question that women identified with her in a very special way. I spoke to the late Emily Stamp on a trip to Winnipeg in 2011. She told me how she had finished high school, took some courses, and found clerical work with the Manitoba government. A very bright woman, Emily rose through the ranks to become Manitoba's first female superintendent of insurance. She told me, at the national meetings, I was the only woman in the room. I asked Emily why so many long-time female supporters appeared to be real groundbreakers in their own right, just like Lotta. Her response was telling and to the point. In World War II, women had a chance to prove themselves and were less inclined to be subordinate. We find ourselves here today in Ottawa, which is perhaps best known as the center of Canadian political life, for better or for worse. Back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, this was also true. However, there was a compelling image of our nation's, there was a competing image of our nation's capital, thanks to Lotta. Almost single-handedly, she put Ottawa on the map, not only as a seat of national government and political debate, but also as a center of Canadian concern and compassion for the rest of the world. To this day, visitors from across Canada come to Ottawa, and they visit Parliament Hill, and then they stroll down Sparks Street. They see the big number 56, and they take photos to show the folks back home, to prove that there really was and is a 56 Sparks Street. That speaks volume about the influence that this great lady had on our social history. And thus, though Lotta received countless awards and honors, I believe that her greatest legacy lives on in the deep emotional reminiscences of the hundreds of thousands of Canadians who still remember her and what she stood for. It is why I became active in the campaign to nominate Lotta to appear on a Canadian banknote. And I was delighted when she made it onto the list of 12 women nominated by the Bank of Canada. Whether Lotta makes the shortlist or not, I believe this campaign has opened up great interest in her life again. Amongst those who still remember her, but also those who were too young, but who have now become interested and inspired by her life. It is for this reason that I have decided to develop a special blog dedicated to Lotta's life, where people can share their own stories and memories. It is in the process of development, and I hope to have it up and running by Lotta's 107th birthday on November 28th.
I think.
Yeah, we're good? Okay. I've been playing with a few ideas for the blog's URL, and I'd like to share them with you. LottaHitschmanova.ca, learnaboutlotta.ca, rememberinglotta.ca. If you have any suggestions of your own, please send them along. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions, comments, and discussion.
Very good.
We're now going to hear from Joy in British Columbia.
Hi. Clive, I have to say this is my first time of meeting you, and it's a real pleasure. Your book has been a huge resource for me through the years. So I think like many of you, I grew up hearing Dr. Lotta on the radio and watching her on television. But it wasn't until about 1997 when I was teaching a Sunday school class at the North Shore Unitarian Church that I started to, on Dr. Lotta, that I started to think about her as a woman. And once I started researching her, and I read Clive's book, and I think I met David somewhere around that time. Anyway, she's become my heart project. So I have traveled around the world researching her, visiting sites that she founded or was involved in, interviewing people. And so what I wanted to do was tell you about one of the first trips that I did. In 2001, 2002, my husband and I, Evan and I, backpacked around the world for a year with our children. We had a 9-year-old son and a teenage daughter. And it was a working holiday of sorts because I got to pick most of the places, and they all had USC connection in some way. So we spent 6 months in Southeast Asia and then 6 months in Europe. And so I was able to visit a lot of hospitals and farms and, see where orphanages had been and talk to people who'd worked with her. And we stayed in a Hotel Pavilion, which is a pretty rough hotel in the port area of Marseille, where Dr. Lotta had lived for a year while she waited for a visa to come through. But what I want to focus in on is our trip to India, because our family ended up spending some time at the Carnatic Health Institute, and Clive writes about it in his book, which is great. I'm sorry, I'm a mover when I talk, so I've been told to stand still so you don't get motion sickness, so I'll try to remember to just stay put. But this was Dr. K.M. Ovadia had started a TB sanitarium, and the Carnatic Health Institute, it was called, in 1935. And in 1955, and I can't remember the particulars, but somehow Dr. Lotta learned about it and ended up going there. And for the next 20 years, she returned annually, called it her second home. And the reason I think it's fascinating is, so I was there, I don't know how many years, 45 years later, still active, she's still beloved, and the impact continues today. So I wanted to tell you a bit about our experience when we were there. We had to go from Mumbai to the Goa area, for those of you who know India, on the west coast, and then take an 8-hour bus trip on this rough mountain road that was barely wide enough for sort of a car and a half. And then it was a 3-hour taxi ride in a taxi that didn't work all that well other than the horn. So when we arrived at Carnatic, I thought, wow, imagine what we've just gone through in 2001. What did Lotta have to do every year when she went in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s? She was an amazing woman. She changed tires, she strode across swollen creeks, she survived on minimal food, she could live anywhere, and there was a degree of being present in her experiences that to me continues to fascinate. So one of the first things that Dr. Lotta did when she got to the hospital, she discovered that their ambulance was this cart drawn by 2 water buffalo. So when she went back to Ottawa in 1955, first thing she did was raise money to buy 2 ambulances. And when she went back the following year, she was able to bring 2 ambulances to go. Right now, It's 150 acres of greenness. It's an oasis. And what had started out as a small TB sanitarium is now this huge hospital complex. It was begun by a man, K.M. Luetia, pardon me, and his wife. And they had 2 sons and a daughter who all became doctors. They married doctors. So there's a legacy now at the hospital that continues to fulfill this health and education mandate of their father. It's run on a Gandhian philosophy of service, devotion, and duty, which I think Dr. Lotta would have found very familiar and very close to her heart. So right now, they have there's a 200-bed hospital. They do about 3,000 operations a year. There is a 60-bed maternity ward, which is full all the time. They had 2,500 deliveries last year. And there's a 150-bed TB sanitarium. And right behind the complex, there's 40 little cottages where family members can live because the TB patients are there for 4 to 5 months, as you can imagine. There are 200 student nurses who come for a 3-year training period from all over India. All the classes are taught in English, which I thought was interesting. But there are so many different languages, as you know, that English was like a one common language that they can learn in. And those nurses are so well trained that they are immediately hired upon graduation in the United States, in the UK, and Saudi Arabia. There's also a group of 40 doctors that come a couple of times a year to do a rural medicine internship. They can do everything in that hospital. So what started out as a small TB sanitarium, as a result of 20 years of USC support and Dr. Lotta's encouragement and friendship, has grown into this amazing complex. So they also have an artificial limb clinic for kids from polio who suffered from polio or had accidents, in particular children, not necessarily just children. They also do a lot of education, and they have a huge area around the hospital that they service in both health and education, which takes me to my second part that I wanted to talk about. So one sunny afternoon, my daughter Emily and I went on this 1-hour, very bumpy dirt road ride to a small farming village. And there was a small little whitewashed hut. I don't know if you got to see many of these, Clyde, but they were inspirational. There's 25 medical centers in the area around the hospital that they're all serviced by the Carnatic Health Institute. And this particular one, their small building, there's a well beside it, and they also service the Women's Institute, which was the part that I found fascinating. So in 1955, when Dr. Lotta was there, she started a monthly women's meeting. And so when I was there in 2001, do the math of years, but it's still meeting every month. 250 women come from all the area around, and some of them have to walk for 2 or 3 hours to get there. The meeting goes as long as necessary, so every woman gets to speak. They do everything from needing to do some fundraising, maybe an animal has died that they need to keep their farm going. They need a new well made. They're having a husband who's drinking too much, so they want to deal with him. A little side note, when I sort of motioned to my daughter Emily, a young teen, and said, and what about the unmarried women? And one of several times where the women kind of conferred and then looked back, and they were surprised because they said, well, why do they need a group? They have you parents fill that. And then they asked if I had a women's group like that. And so I said, well, my husband Evan and I had belonged to a couples group for 5 years, and we met every 2 weeks and talked about family and finances and work. And then again, there was sort of all this mutter on the side. And I said to Evan afterwards, I think they were feeling quite sorry for this Canadian woman who had so many problems she had to meet every 2 weeks to solve issues. So it was a lovely give and take of what I consider my gifts in my life and what they had as their gifts in their life, and they were so generous and welcoming. I actually have, this is a a lovely, oh, I don't know if you can see it, but it's a bag that they made for me during our several hours meeting. It also happened to be the day that the nurse who comes once a month, she was on site. She services 15,000 people in a 60-kilometer area. So a lot of these services were put into place by Lotta in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And she's still, it's a bit like a rock star. You know, they have the person high cardboard cutouts of whoever. Well, there's one of Lotta that's left up in the main room all the time. And they have books that she wrote in. We stayed in her little cottage where she used to stay every time she was at the hospital. And then, you know, I've since traveled, actually, Kate, I think, are you there, Kate? Anyways, I'm hoping she gets a chance to speak.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Kate. Well, Kate and I were supposed to meet up in Bangladesh, but there were elections happening and lots of riots, so we had to cancel our meeting. We happened to travel during 9/11, and so suddenly we were in Indonesia, and it got a little dicey with the kids, so we had to leave. So I still need to go to Korea and to Vietnam. Those are my next big countries, because this woman's story just continues and continues in the impact of her life. I was very lucky to get support from the USC and spend some time in the National Archives going through their 92,000 items that are stored, jotting newsletters and letters and budgets and photographs, and there's some films that there's so much available that I'm constantly trying to make sure I got to figure out a way to share more of it, I think. What intrigues me about this woman, and I have two quotes here. One is from a pope. So Pope John Paul said that Mother Teresa did not get the work done that she did by being a saint. And I think that's probably a bit about Dr. Lotta too. She was a Mother Teresa with attitude is usually how I describe her. And then there was a very interesting, which one was it? Anyways, a movie director, he said he's never interested in saints. He's interested in saints with warts. Now, not physical, just metaphorical. But Dr. Lotta was obsessed and intense and didn't let anything stand in her way. So she could spend the morning talking with great compassion to perhaps a crippled Korean mother whose son had died. And then in the afternoon, she could storm into a government office and demand that she get a train to take Canadian barley to an isolated village that had been forgotten. So I'm just so appreciative of the work. Like David, I'm excited to hear about your blog. I hadn't realized about that. I think that's a terrific idea. And I just want to sing this woman's praises. So anything we can do like this is great. I have voted numerous times for that, picture on the dollar bill. I hope everyone else has too. So please, let's just, if we can do more things like this, wonderful. And anything I can do to be supportive of that blog, David, I'm happy to. I'm working on a memoir historical book called The Atomic Mosquito, which is what Dr. Lotta was called by journalists across Canada, because if you didn't give her front page coverage for her fundraising trips, she let you know about it. And I'm very appreciative of being here. And I'm interested to hear Kate's. I hope, Kate, you get to talk about some of your travels because you're out in the field now doing these. So thank you.
Thank you, Joy. And we'd like at this point to encourage anyone with a question to type it in on the upper right-hand screen chat, or to send us a text message. The number's there at the chat, 613-617-4551. And we do have Kate with us here. And bring us up to, what is USC doing now?
That is a very big question. I am so pleased that I could be the staff member from the current staff of USC asked to be present this afternoon, again with people that I admire very much and that I've learned a lot about Dr. Lotta's history and what she brought to USC in her very long era with the organization. I've been privileged to work at USC for more than 2 decades now, and I recognize many names of the people who've signed up and are joining us this afternoon. Some of you have heard me speak about USC's work, and I try to always emphasize, though we are very much an agency of today and issues of the last few decades, there are very strong themes from the time of Dr. Lotta that she set in place that we absolutely follow today, and it's done very unconsciously. We don't have monthly meetings to make sure we're still doing these things that she would be supportive of. It happens so naturally from the organization and the values that she instilled in it. The focus of our work today, as many of you might be aware of, is around food security and seed security, dealing with issues of hunger and injustice in Latin America, East and West Africa, and also in Asia. And we also have work in Canada now, again working on seed and food issues here in our own country, which we really think she would be very supportive of action happening in Canada as well. Some of the themes that we still have flowing through all of this work is one of working with local people. I understand from Clyde's book and from talking to people and occasionally meeting people overseas who knew her, she always had local people as the leaders of her projects, of her programs, and that's still the case with USC today. It's extremely unusual for us to have a Canadian overseas in anything more than perhaps a graduate student or somebody on a very specific task. In all of our programs, they're led by local organizations and sometimes groups we've been able to help form from previous USC Canada offices. A second feature is that of sustainability. And certainly in the 1940s and 50s, that was not a term that was used widely or known widely in anything to do with international work or humanitarian assistance. And she believed really strongly that every program in orphanages, the hospital that Joy spoke of, needed to be able to manage eventually without the USC. So today, all of our programming in agriculture and seeds, with organizations, with women's organizations, we also do a lot in soil and water conservation and agroforestry and organics, of course. All of that goes with growing food. All of it is based on principles of sustainability. It may take a long time. Agriculture is slow-moving progress, but we're always thinking in those terms, and we've been so very pleased over the years to see programs move on and be self-sustaining. And that leads to the third point, that she always knew when there was a time to move on. And there are wonderful lists in Clyde's book and some maps that have been produced about the phasing in and out the countries USC worked in and then moved on from, that she knew when there was a time to move to a place where there was greater urgency of need. And that continues to happen today for us, whether it's moving from country programs, for example, in Indonesia. After many, many decades there, we phased out of Indonesia, and it allowed us to begin programs in Bolivia about 10 years ago. We also, even within programs and within countries, we're constantly working with our partners to think of, okay, in a few years' time, perhaps over into that next valley in Nepal, or onto a different region within Ethiopia, or again, into another watershed in Bolivia or in Central America. And just in this last year, we've been able to begin new partnerships in Guatemala and Nicaragua to complement the Central American work. So those three features of local people at the heart of the work, sustainability, and knowing when to move on and to phase into new areas are very much a part of our work still today. There's one last little point, and it was brought up by something Clyde said about Lotta in her early years and her amazing gift with languages. And I'm very, very pleased that if any of you happen to come by the office here at 56 Spark Street, we're now on the 6th floor. We moved down one floor earlier this year. You'll hear us working in 3 languages virtually all the time. English, French, and Spanish are used in the office quite freely, and I admire my trilingual colleagues so very much. And also, of course, overseas, we probably get to 10 or 15 different working languages that we work in, local ones in West Africa, Ethiopia. In every country, there are even more languages that we work in and endeavor so much to translate and share, and ourselves learn those languages to communicate even more closely, which was such a part of Lotta's connection during her lifetime as the head of USC. I'd be very happy if there are any questions at this time or any other time as well. Please do contact us.
We do have a question from Meg Roberts for our three panelists, and Kate, you can chime in as well. If Lotta was chosen to be on a Canadian bill, which three values would you say she embodied that might be put on that bill next to her picture to inspire Canadians?
David's going to tuck in here. I'll switch with David.
I have a thought, but maybe we ask Clyde first.
Well, I'm somewhat involved with the Bank of Canada. They've been gathering the opinions of people, and that's how the 12 names are put together, Emily Carr, and so on. And I think she's may still be in the running when they're down to 5. The last stage is giving those 5 names to the finance minister, and he is choosing. And I was told the other day, keep your eyes and ears open. So maybe you'll see her there. Personally, I think of all those 12, she's got the broadest qualifications. I admire Emily Carr, I admire Nellie McClung, I admire the lady who was an engineer and built hurricanes and so on. But you have to look them up and see what they did, and they are historical figures. Whereas, thanks to David Rain, but thanks to all of you, really, Lotta's name has survived. One thing about some of the Quakers saw her in that uniform and thought that she was military-minded. Warrior for peace was the phrase that was used in return, and it was practical. So I think that the adjectives you might use about her were compassion, practicality, and devotion.
David?
Well, thank you, and I agree entirely with Clyde's adjectives. I was just going to say that what Kate was describing earlier could well be, in part, the answer to Meg's question, in the sense that Lotta was very deeply, one of her values was respecting other people's cultures, and that's often looked at in her overseas work, but as a refugee to Canada, I also see an aspect of her life that shows that somehow she radiated tolerance amongst cultures, amongst faiths, amongst races, and that's an essential part, I think, of the legacy that she implanted in Canada. And on the world stage, for those that are old enough, you may recall that the year 1975 was the International Year of Women. And a great deal of activity, of course the women's movement had already been quite active, but on the world stage, a lot of activity suddenly started up in 1975, and development programs everywhere were including women, they'd been forgotten, and so on. What I wanted to point out, and this is the aspect of Lotta as a groundbreaker, from 1945 to 1975, Lotta was promoting women's development, and not just in a charitable sense, but training and empowerment for them to have leadership roles and so on for 30 years. And I think it's fair to say the rest of the world caught up to where Lotta was. So I would say a groundbreaker is the best way to describe her.
Given that it's money, I was thinking of both frugality and generosity, which she embodied as well. And Joy, are you there? Okay. If you could, Joy, if you could push share video or click on share video. Would love to see your face again. And anyone else with a question or a comment we're here.
Would this be a time I could give this anecdote?
Clyde, while we're waiting. Okay.
There she comes. I wanted to pick up, is this the moment?
Yes.
I want to pick up on your word of frugality.
Okay.
She was well known for making anyone who typed a thing to avoid any margins on the page. She went right to the edges of everything. And in a way, that's a metaphor for her own life. She went to the edges of things. And it's true, she, anytime she went in, had to go into a hotel, she'd pick up those little packets of soaps and bring them back too, and on and on. And she was very concerned that the costs would be kept down. Her very first trip was funded by the USC in Boston, actually. And she made good use of that. She went to 6 different countries and started all those first programs, which were very well thought through.
Could I share a joke?
Sure.
Unless Joy is on, but we gather that Lotta, as we've heard some anecdotes, could be quite a difficult person and a tough character, but she also had a lighter side and a sense of humor that not everyone is aware of. So she told a story in 1973 that I thought I would share with you. It's about her uniform, and she used to make jokes about her uniform, and that was one of her running gags. I only have the uniform because it is so practical and the only real way of traveling to the areas where we have programs. This still confuses many people, so I tell you what happened in an airport in Moncton a few weeks ago. A very old lady came to me, and she was laden with parcels, and she said, "Are you a stewardess?" And I said, "No, but could I possibly help you?" And she said, "No, thank you very much, but you look like you are doing something very useful, so here is 25 cents.
Nice story.
Okay. Thank you. Joy, do we have 3 values that... Joy, if you can, type them in, and I'm going to start it's 6 o'clock, so I'm going to start the closing here. I want to thank everyone again for joining us for this afternoon's program. Thank you for your ongoing support of USC Canada, which works every day to eliminate world hunger through sustainable agriculture, biodiversity, and seeds for survival. I want to thank our technical team, Stephanie Hughes and Kathleen Clark. I want, who's waving here. I want also to let everyone know that next year's Mark Mosier DeWolf Lecture will be webcast from Toronto on October 22nd, 2017. The speaker will be the Reverend Mark Bellatini, and the subject will be the life of Mark Mosier DeWolf and the struggle for the acceptance of openly gay, lesbian, and transgender ministers in the Unitarian Universalist movement in North America. The first congregation in Canada to call an openly gay minister was Mississauga, Ontario in 1982. That minister was Mark DeWolf. This lecture was named after him after he died of AIDS in 1988. The lecture next year will be the first time that his life will be the subject of the lecture. Please join us then. For now, au revoir. Oh yes, and the webcast of this presentation will be available through YouTube and through other sources, and you can arrange to have it linked to your congregation's webpage. Let's everyone do that.